Hello, everybody. Well, thank you so much, Fernanda, for your kind words. And thanks to everybody for being here. As Fernanda just mentioned, it's a very special moment for me, a very special talk, because it's in Rio. And I was born here in Rio. I grew up in Switzerland. I only lived 1 year here in Rio. My first year, basically. My parents are both Swiss, but my father used to work here in Brazil. So it's kind of quite amazing to actually be back in my place of birth and have this privilege, this pleasure to give this talk. So I'm really happy about that. And as Fernanda just mentioned, I do understand Portuguese. Speaking would be quite painful, I think, for both of us, or for all of us, let's say, because it would be quite slow and quite, well, with some kind of pauses and hesitations from my side. But if you have any questions, comments, or things to discuss, feel free to do that in Portuguese. That's absolutely fine. And also, please feel free to do it during my talk. To be quite honest, I usually prefer the more kind of interactive format. So, and also it helps me to know what is of interest to you, where maybe I have to elaborate further or where we can debate. So the idea would really be, we're not a huge kind of class of 200 people. So the idea would be to also have some time to actually discuss and maybe just exchange points of views, and also maybe you can complement what I'm saying with your own experience. So please don't hesitate to interrupt. Raise your hand whenever you want. I think that would actually add quite an important dimension to my talk as well. So my talk this afternoon is going to be about something which, as Fernanda also mentioned, will complement my talk in Curitiba. In Curitiba, I was talking about drones, and I will also be talking about drones today. But I was talking about how drones make us look up, how they make us think about the air. This is one thing which I've actually realized in my fieldwork. I've been working for about 5 years together with a group of colleagues, PhD students, postdocs, back in Switzerland, on drones with all kinds of case studies. For example, police drones, but also drones for agriculture, even privately owned drones like the hobby drones, these kind of things. And one of the things which I always realized in this fieldwork was that actually everybody that was flying a drone was first of all looking up, looking at this weird little object flying in the air and thinking about the air, basically. So my talk in Curitiba was about this way of looking up. And here in Rio, I will complement this with the second kind of dimension, which is the looking down dimension. Because of course, drones are, well, not always. I mean, they could just be transporting things like medication or whatever. But very often drones are also equipped with cameras. So they help, or they allow actually a kind of a downward looking gaze, a downward looking surveillance gaze. And that's going to be the topic, that's going to be the key point of interest for this afternoon. And this really connects with a very, very long-standing, I think it's now, I cannot count the years anymore, it's horrible. I think it's about 22 years now that I've been doing work on surveillance. I'm a surveillance scholar, surveillance studies, a scholar, if you want, so interested in digital technologies in general and in specific ways in which they, let's say, accumulate, transfer and analyze data, and in which they then, through this analyzation or through this analysis and kind of collection and transfer of data, how they then impact everyday life. So that was my key interest for the last 20 years, 22 years. And as a geographer, I've always tried to think about these problematics, these kind of surveillance technologies, from video surveillance to drones, passing through, actually I did quite a lot of research on mega events, sport mega events. I wasn't here in Rio during the Olympics and the World Cup, but I did research on, for example, the World Cup before in Germany, and also on Vancouver Olympic Games. So this has also been something quite important. But always I've tried to add like one specific card to this question of surveillance and everyday life, which was, or is, still is, the card of space. So I'm always trying to think about the spatial dimension in the exercise of surveillance. So space as both something that impacts surveillance, but that is also produced by surveillance. And I will talk a little bit more about that just in a second. But when I'm talking about this downward looking gaze, this kind of drone mediated gaze from above onto the ground, of course, I'm also talking about space, because this gaze is all about space. It's about the ground, which is being kind of observed, controlled, maybe also acted on, but it's also about space as a volume, airspace. I mean, there's a lot of spatial dimensions in there. And what I'm trying to do this afternoon is to play, and I'm quite consciously use the word play, because it's also something that I think is quite joyful. I play with three vocabularies, three different terminologies, to try to make sense and to actually express the different spatial logics of the drone gaze, the specific logics in which the drone affects and interacts with space. So it's a kind of exploratory talk where I will talk at least these three vocabularies. I will distill them from three, unfortunately, masculine thinkers and artists. Well, the first is Kandinsky, Wassily Kandinsky, modernist art. You all know his work, of course, and you see one of his paintings here on the wall. Then Michel Foucault, philosopher, sociologist, with a very important and very strong interest in questions of power and space. And then Peter Sloterdijk, who's a German philosopher. He's the only one of the three who's still alive, German philosopher who did, amongst other things, a really quite impressive, quite important trilogy, kind of three different books on what he calls spheres. So he talks about bubbles, about foams, and about globes. So that's the three volumes of his trilogy. And I will also draw on his vocabulary to make sense and to try to capture different dimensions of this kind of spatial aspects, of these spatial logics of the drone gaze. So that's the key objective of this afternoon. And I hope, and Fernanda told me that some of you are working in design and aesthetics, so that it in some sense resonates also with questions you are kind of having in your own work, in your own kind of programs, studies, which are, well, about how today, if we want to understand reality and we want to engage with reality, how actually and through what terms, through what kind of vocabulary, through what tools in a way we can do that. What are our words, what are our kind of categories of thinking through which we can make sense of the world? And I think that is also for me one of the, maybe the big question, the big point, the big message I want to bring across, beyond the example of the drone, beyond the example of my kind of geographical engagement with that, this question of actually how and through what terminology and what toolbox really we can make sense of the world. And I think personally my basic assumption in that is that, well, we need tools, we need metaphors, we need terminologies. So it's kind of something unavoidable, because we have to think. I mean, Ludwig Wittgenstein, another very interesting philosopher, well, he said, my world ends where my language ends. So we kind of need language, but each vocabulary, each terminology we use is also necessarily limited and problematic, because it reduces the reality into a specific range of predefined categories of thinking. So that's why I play with different vocabularies, because I think they kind of complement, sometimes maybe even contradict or enter into tension with each other. But in each case, they kind of allow us to capture and question different dimensions of reality, and in my case, different dynamics of power relating to the drone gaze as it falls onto the ground, because this is my case study this afternoon. So that's my long-term interest here. You see on the slide this let's say, interaction between surveillance and space. You see it here on the ground. Well, who knows the picture on the right? Quite a few here. Yeah. So this is Bentham's panopticon, which was quite famously kind of discussed in Michel Foucault's surveiller, punir. What's the English? Yeah. Disciplinary.
In English, I forgot.
Yeah. Discipline, punish, maybe. Discipline. Yeah, that's it. So basically, beyond the title of the book, what is important here is that, as Foucault explains, the panopticon is kind of a built environment which mediates the exercise of power, which mediates the normalization of the detainees. And the idea is that, so the detainees, they are in kind of cells, individual cells positioned, which are actually transparent on both sides, so at the outside wall and on the inside wall, so as to make sure that they are constantly visible from the central tower of the prison. So the idea being that, well, not only are they constantly visible, but they also know and are aware of their constant visibility. So that's the key point, the key idea of the panopticon, as Jeremy Bentham had developed it in the 18th century. And what is interesting for me here, and I'm just giving you 3 examples of how surveillance interacts with space here, is that in this example of the panopticon, surveillance works through space. It is the spatial organization of the panopticon that makes surveillance work, or through which the exercise of surveillance onto the detainee kind of works. You see that point. So space here as a specific architecture is not only the product of surveillance, it's also the producer of surveillance. So we really see this kind of interaction between the two, space on the one hand, surveillance on the other. I mean, this in the middle here, that's Playmobil. I would expect you to have played with similar things. What is interesting here is 2 points I wanted to make. The first one, and still I'm in this world of surveillance and space, just giving a few examples here. The first one is that this is all about passage points, isn't it? It's what Steve Graham quite famously called passage point urbanism. You circulate from point to point, from control to control, from check to check. And it's really this kind of punctual logic of surveillance. Well, you are being controlled at one point in space, and then you circulate to the next one, and then to the next one, and then to the next one. But it is inherently spatial. You get controlled, you are being controlled through specific spatially articulated points, which filter, which control, which can maybe prevent, maybe accelerate some flows. So it's all about a whole management of flows that pass through specific points in space. So space is really not just a static background. It is, again, much more. It is actually both the product and the means of surveillance, the tool through which surveillance works. And the one here on the left, this is an older system, let's say. This is from Dionysius the Ancient, actually 400 before Christ, and he was a kind of tyrant, well, we could say that dictator, living in Sicily, Italy, and he had like a central palace in his area of influence. And around the central court of that palace, he had these listening devices, which you here see in white. So basically, this was a system, a dispositif, an apparatus in Foucauldian terms, for listening in to the conversations of his population. And what I find interesting here is that, to some extent, there is a very strong analogy between this kind of listening device and a surveillance camera, because it also creates this spatial dichotomy between the control spaces, the control room, which is here kind of slightly higher up, surveiller, surveiller, surveiller in French, for example. In German, we have the same überwachen, which means a kind of a higher up position, also in terms of power, of course. A control room on the one hand and a control room on the other. So, but again, it's all about space. It's all about here separating spaces, creating this kind of two categories of space, the space in which control is being exercised, power is being exercised, and the space onto which power is being exercised. Both in terms of, well, control, but also, well, if need be, I would expect there to be kind of, well, personnel who could intervene, who could maybe stop certain conversations, who could maybe arrest people, whatever. So we have, for me, a very clear analogy between, well, this kind of listening device and the kind of the visual type of surveillance as we see it today in the case of CCTV. You've got a question? No? Nobody questions? No question? Right, so that's the kind of thing I'm interested in. That's the kind of thing I'm interested in, and I'm kind of trying to understand these kind of things through this specific spatial focus. And within that specific spatial focus, I'm also very sensitive to questions of power in a Foucauldian sense, which means, well, power for Foucault is the capacity to act on other actions. So what I'm asking myself is how in these different examples, and how in the case of mega events, how in the case of drones, what does that mean for the capacity to act on other actions? For the police, for private individuals, for professionals, photographers, and so on and so on. Of course, there's army drones. How does this kind of technology that works through the accumulation, analysis, and transfer of data affect the ways in which the capacity to act on other action is socially distributed? And what role does space play in that, as both the producer and product of this kind of novel power relations that go through the digital technology? So basic claims, space contributes in many ways and on many levels to the function and impact of surveillance. Space must be approached as one of the constitutive dimensions of surveillance rather than as a static background structure. That's what I was talking about before. And this is the key point of today's talk. Also, I've been talking about that. If we want to explore and question the ways in which surveillance is bound up with space, we need a vocabulary to do so. We need vocabularies in plural to do so. As I've said, because each vocabulary is, well, unavoidable, but also inherently problematic, because it limits, it reduces reality to a certain amount of predefined categories of thinking. Right, so that's the three vocabularies I want to play with this afternoon: points, lines, planes, Kandinsky, fixity, flexibility, enclosure, openness, these kind of things, going back to Foucault's distinction between discipline and security, and then the spheres in a Sloterdijkian sense. Now, the points, lines, planes, if we take Kandinsky first, I mean, I don't think you're all geographers, or at least not everybody in here, but if you were a geographer, you would know to what extent the discipline of geography is, well, I wouldn't say obsessed, but at least influenced by this kind of vocabulary. It's this kind of cartographic vocabulary of, you know, like borderlines, networks. Well, I used one of these before: passage points, nodal points, railway stations, all kinds of points, all kinds of lines, all kinds of planes, urban zones, urban areas. Well, I mean, geography as a discipline is deeply anchored in a two-dimensional way of thinking reality, which I think is inherently problematic, because on the one hand, it reduces reality to a kind of a plane, two-dimensional kind of thing. Well, because all these vocabularies, they are by definition two-dimensional, but also problematic, and that's the second point, because what geography predominantly does is derive this vocabulary from a kind of Euclidean mathematical background. And as we all know, in mathematics, especially in Euclidean mathematics, these are actually abstractions. So there is no mathematical point in reality. There is no mathematical line in reality. That's just a different kind of level of thinking yeah, it's a mathematical abstraction on the one hand. On the other hand, we, as social scientists, we deal with an actual, really existing reality that has necessarily a certain kind of extension. And that is far beyond the kind of point line plane definition you could find in Euclidean writings or in other mathematical writings. So to me, this kind of, as I've said, obsession, or at least kind of strong focus on this kind of vocabulary in my discipline has always been quite problematic. Yet it is there, it is out there, and we all use it. It's very present in surveillance studies as well. I mean, we all talk about networks, we all talk about borderlines, we all talk about these kind of things without, however, really defining them, without, however, actually really operationalizing these tools, these terms, for our analytical purposes. And that's what I wanted to do with my interest in Kandinsky and Klee. Because what is interesting in Kandinsky and Klee, I mean, here I only have Kandinsky, but I also looked into Paulo Klee, which is another kind of modernist painter, very close and actually well known to Kandinsky. What Kandinsky and Klee, well, let's stick to Kandinsky, what he wants to do is to understand the specific forces that develop from the artistic ways of space production. So this is an artistic way of space production for Kandinsky. And what he's interested in is to actually understand the impact of these graphic elements onto the onlooker. That's what he calls the force developing from the spatial grammar he uses in his paintings. So that is for me the kind of the starting analogy with my own endeavor. First of all, he's interested not in actual mathematical abstractions, but he's interested in actual forms that assume a certain extension, a certain physical proportion. I mean, these things, they are actually drawn lines, actually painted circles, actually have colored planes, and so on. So there is a dimension, an actual physical dimension to it. And also what he's interested in the impact, in the forces developing from these graphic forms. So how they act on us, how they act on the public. And this is exactly what I want to understand in the case of drones. What specific forces develop from the spatially articulated gaze of the drone? So there is a strong analogy between Kandinsky's endeavor and my own interest in this kind of vocabulary. Are you still following me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who in here is actually would consider himself or herself a surveillance scholar, working on technologies, digital technologies, and its impact on? So there's two. The others are all in design and aesthetics.
Communication.
Geography, yeah. Okay. Communication?
No.
No.
Law.
Law. Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Interesting. Cool. So this is where I'm coming from. This is where my interest in Kandinsky comes from. I think he gives me actually potentially a vocabulary, a grammar, a spatial grammar of power, which I can, as a geographer, operationalize to understand how digital technologies interact with the spaces of the everyday. That was my basic ambition. And in analogy, I mean, I've put it here, invites an exploration of the punctual, the linear, and the planar logics and forces inherent in the spatially articulated practices of surveillance. So maybe a third element which is important to me, so there is this idea of the extension. These are actually physically existing graphic forms, not mathematical abstractions. There's the level of the impact, the force developing from it. And the third one, which is important for me, is the relativist understanding of these graphic forms. Because as Kandinsky says here, actually, it's not possible to know when the point becomes a plane or when the line starts to exist. These things are kind of dynamic, depending on their role within the bigger whole, within the overall painting. So something can be a point if it's internally undifferentiated and makes a certain type of impact. But in other cases, the same contour, the same kind of size of the point can become a plane if it is internally structured and if it is not making a certain kind of punctual impression, but a more kind of diffuse planar force. So these elements cannot be once and for all distinguished from each other. There's a continuum and there's a relational and relativist understanding. So they become lines, points, and planes in relation to each other. And I think that is really interesting because that's exactly how surveillance works. These different spatial articulations of the aerial gaze, they interact, they complement each other. They kind of, in sometimes, well, they work for each other. So let's take, for example, a drone that follows, well, a police drone, let's say, in Switzerland, in Neuchâtel, we have that, which are actually as quick as a car. So they could follow a car, a clear linear logic of surveillance, a kind of a linearity. But then there could be a police patrol at one stage intervening and stopping the car on the ground in a very punctual, very fixed, very predefined way. So the two logics of control complement each other. But it could also be that actually they kind of conflict with each other. If the point makes it impossible for the drone to continue, for example, if it was blocking the linear surveillance. So we here have a vocabulary of graphic forms which give us a first toolbox to understand different ways in which surveillance interacts with space and different ways in which these measures interact with each other. Now, if we go a little deeper into that, it's interesting to actually see what types of forces, what kinds of impact Kandinsky associates with planes, with lines, and with points. So in the first point, the point, a small world cut off more or less equally from all sides, associated with fixity, restraint, concision, self-containment, and rest. And this is interesting because we here find the whole kind of spatial vocabulary, which we can then use to think about the impacts of spatially articulated and mediated forms of control. So let's take a fan zone during the World Cup in Brazil. A fan zone is like an enclosed area for watching football games, but it's also an area around which all kinds of surveillance devices have been positioned. Cameras, even in some cases, devices for the detection of hazardous physical, biochemical materials, kind of aerial surveillance forms. So it's like a fixed portion of space that is being monitored in constrained, singled out, restrained, and concise way. A point. You see? We can have a drone above it that can zoom out, that can move in the air, that can change its position, the direction of its gaze, and that brings a much more dynamic dimension into the picture that complements the control of the confined space on the ground. This drone can move into one specific direction. Direction, connection, movement, dynamism. I'm quoting Kandinsky here, what he says about the line. So the drone can have a linear logic of surveillance, but it can also have a more planar logic of surveillance. It can zoom out. It can create like the growing point, or it can work like a rotating line. A line like let's say, for example, if he sweeps the zone, moving forward, backward in very rigorous. I hope that's fine for the translation. Sorry about that. So what I'm trying to say here is that we find a first vocabulary that gives us a whole range of additional terms. Well, some of them are here on the slide, which allow us to understand the specific spatial logic inherent in surveillance, and then, depending on that or deriving from this, acting on everyday life. Logics of constraint, fixity, spatial kind of, separation, logic of movement, following, channeling, dynamism, these kind of things, flows, and logics of kind of, planar logics, which obviously are at a different scale, but also, again, can be dynamic in that they can grow, that can be reduced, become points again. So I think here we have a first vocabulary that we can quite easily import into the social sciences to think about different logics of surveillance and different ways in which they will impact everyday life. Yeah.
Can we make questions now? Or
Yeah, please do.
you prefer if we...
No, I prefer now.
Right. Well, I can understand that the act of surveying or surveillance, I can understand that the act of surveillance, especially in your case, focusing on drones, is a total three-dimensional process, and it understands the space also as a political three-dimensional volume, right? But I was thinking on the case of the gaze of the aerial views. I mean, do you think that is the aerial gaze of the drones is also ignoring the three-dimensionality of the space when although it's working three-dimensionally, when it smashes everything into a two-dimensional interpretation of what it sees?
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a perfect question, and it was not planned, but it allows me to lead to the next part, actually, to the next parts of the talk, because it asks, or it is about this kind of two and three dimensionality of reality. I think for me, the point line plane metaphors or the vocabulary, even if I derive it from Kandinsky, it remains two-dimensional. Yeah. It remains inherently, because it's still points, lines, and planes, even though, I mean, they have an extension in terms of the extension they assume on a painting, for example. And for me, this was typically a vocabulary very interesting to understand the drone gaze, as you just said, as it smashes on the ground. It's these kind of things. That's my examples of that first vocabulary. And I think it is very relevant and very operational if we want to understand these kind of phenomena. So this is of course up there. There's a form of military surveillance. What we see is there is a planar dimension, so the large scale, but within that planar dimension there can be specific foci, kind of points of gravity onto which a more kind of specific, a more kind of maybe intense type of control is being exerted. We have like what we see here is actually that's not drones, it's planes, surveillance planes, and they can be mapped. Actually, they can be mapped, and we see it would be interesting to actually make a much more detailed analysis about where they were flying, why they are flying there. But again, you see it's specific kind of places, specific locations, which are of increased interest and which form like punctual centers of gravity of the gaze as you said, it smashes onto the ground. And I think the vocabulary that comes with the point line plane kind of metaphors from Kandinsky, that of fixity, of movement, of kind of restraint, of concision, but also of separation and connection, if we just talk about points and lines, can be very interesting to think about actually these kind of things. That's at least what I've tried to do. For example, I will show you that later in the talk, or I can actually anticipate. Yeah, this is actually a map I did together with a friend of mine during the World Cup, the European Football Championships in Switzerland. and this in particular is the city of Zurich. And we did actually map all the surveillance measures as we found them on the ground. So this is Zurich during the European Football Championships 2008. And what you see is that you see, well, you don't really see it very well, but you see there's planes. Well, these are the fan zones, fan villages, actually, where fans were kind of put to sleep and to party. You also have much more kind of linear. You really, I'm sorry, it's not very kind of clear. Maybe a question of quality here, but you should see much more linear kind of logics of surveillance. For example, specific streets along which kind of fan corridors were erected. You also see much more punctual logics of control. These are mostly railway stations, but also bus stops, and in some cases, specific points where police patrols were stationed. So you see a whole spatially articulated system of control, which in its totality kind of impacted social life during the event. And you had something, I would say, well, not identical, obviously, because Rio is not Zurich, but the logic, these kind of interacting, punctual, linear, and planar forms of control were exactly the same in Rio, for example, for the World Cup, Football World Cup a few years later, or even for the Olympic Games. So that's the kind of thing I think we can do with this first vocabulary, with this vocabulary of points. And that's something, but it's, as I said, it's problematic because, for example, it ignores the three-dimensionality of these kind of realities here. So ultimately we remain in a two-dimensional understanding and kind of toolbox for these kind of things. And that's where we need to go beyond the first vocabulary, where I think Foucault and even more so Sloterdijk are actually much more interesting. But then Foucault and Sloterdijk would miss other things. So I think actually these things have to be taken together. Questions? Other questions? Yeah.
Posso falar em português?
Sim, pode.
Sim. Então, eu fico me perguntando sobre de que maneira esse olhar e toda essa espacialidade, né, do olhar do drone, seja sob a forma de linhas, pontos ou planos, na sua pesquisa, em que momento esse olhar incide sobre os corpos no espaço?
Uhum.
Ou seja, em que momento se dá a passagem desse olhar abstrato, digamos assim, para o poder, efetivamente, que é quando ele incide, esse olhar passa a incidir sobre o modo como os corpos se distribuem e se comportam no espaço e vivem o espaço. Porque em todos os outros exemplos, no início da sua fala, desde a orelha de Dionísio até o panóptico do Brentano, isso incide diretamente sobre os corpos no espaço. E como que você percebe isso no olhar do drone?
Wonderful, thank you very much. I think it depends on the type of drone usage as well. I mean, the drone can remain hidden, distant, secret, especially if we talk about the really big drones, which fly very, very high. So, for example, the Swiss Army has for many, many years, well, it's actually Swiss Army drones, but used by the Swiss Border Guards, which is a federal police unit. For many years, they have patrolled the Swiss national border, but they would fly so high up that they would not be seen and felt on the ground, or they would be seen and felt on the ground very lately. People have already been monitored for quite a while until they realize, because there is a little sound, that there might be something above their head. So here in this example, the impact on the body is not immediate. It only comes when there is actual physical intervention on the ground. that is kind of that depends on the drone gaze, but it could remain abstract, it could remain distant, it could remain unknown in that specific example. In other examples, especially when they fly much lower, I think that the actual impact on behavior, on affect, on bodily experiences is much more direct, it's much more immediate. And I know, for example, in Neuchâtel, the police uses now drones to monitor fans coming from the railway station and going to the football stadium at the lake. So there would be drones that follow the fans on the ground. And here, of course, the impact is much more immediate, especially if you consider that there's also police officers on the ground, there's also private security, there's also fences, actually. There's a whole dispositif within which the drone plays one specific role. And the whole dispositif is a dispositif for the management of mobility, of movement. So it impacts immediately on how bodies are being channeled, how they are being filtered, how they are being controlled from point to point through this kind of predefined corridor, monitored in mobile, etc., flexible ways from the air. So in this case, the impact on the body and on the behavior and on the actual VICU, the lived experience of the city, is almost immediate. So we have two extreme examples, and I think that's probably the way most technologies work. I mean, it all depends on the specific place of one specific technology within a wider, what Kevin Haggerty and Richard Erickson call surveillance assemblage. And it's the wider surveillance assemblage that makes all the difference. But what I personally find quite interesting, and I always come back to this, is actually this, and that leads us back to this idea of the listening device from this kind of Syracusan tyrant, is that surveillance, especially if we talk about techno-mediated surveillance, distantiates the controllers from the controlled. It creates this kind of spatial but also social and actually mental distance between one world and the other. Unlike the police officers who can be seen or who can be maybe, well, let's say challenged, or at least kind of we can discuss with the person. There is a certain type of interaction possible. The technology makes the control ever more distant and ever more abstract. And I think in this case, for me, this actually growing distance is one of the key issues in terms of power we have to address, because it becomes ever more difficult to actually bodily experience, at least in the first moment, the kind of surveillance to which we are exposed. It is this kind of abstract thing which we don't really understand, we don't even know, and which remains abstract until, well, it really acts. But then, well, it really acts it can act in very powerful ways. So I think this growing distance, this growing spatial distance, is one of the key dimensions of techno-mediated forms of surveillance as we see it today. Other questions? Yeah.
Pensando na própria pergunta da Fernanda, apontou o impacto do drone nos corpos. Perguntaria qual o impacto dos corpos nos drones. Porque pensando na video surveillance, né, não são todos os corpos que atraem, que atiram a atenção. Né? Então, pensando também na própria especificidade de falando dos corpos, mas também em relação aos corpos com espaço. Quais corpos em quais espaços afetam o drone?
Wonderful. Yeah, I think, I mean, we very, very good question. And again, I mean, my answer can only be, it depends. It depends because, I mean, of course, there is police drones, there's military drones, but there's also all kinds of other professions that now use drones. Architects use drones, firefighters use drones, because they can overfly kind of burning houses, for example. Even families use drone on a Saturday afternoon, maybe to take some pictures from the air. And in each case, of course, the question of the body has to be thought in very different ways and acts and is being acted on in very, very different ways. But I think in any case, I mean, of course, technology mediates a certain relation between monitors or controllers and the controls, but it's also their predefined stereotypical ways of understanding the world. What is a risky body? What is a risky behavior? What is a kind of unwanted individual, which will then affect their way of using the drone. So it's not necessarily only the technology that makes the difference, it's also the kind of the intentions and the imaginaries of the drone users. And if we are in a context of racist, for example, policing, then the drone will be used differently than in a context of maybe more kind of democratically open and more legitimized forms of policing. But anyway, I mean, the point I was going to make is, of course, it's about space, but it's not about empty space. These spaces are being socially used. These are socially kind of produced and occupied. So, of course, it's about more than just a surface on the ground. And this is, again, where the question of the volume comes into play, because these spaces are volumes, they are atmospheres, they are kind of shared spaces of togetherness, as Sloterdijk would say. They're actually atmospheres and ambiances rather than just material environments. And that's where the social, where the bodily, where the experimental, where the affective dimensions come into play. And of course, the drone, depending on its use, depending on its users, depending on their intentions, the drone kind of follows these kind of atmospheric and multidimensional aspects of the space it controls. It's very easy. These kind of things are very easy to show, even easier than with the drone, when we look into the spatial distribution of surveillance cameras. I mean, it's absolutely obvious that surveillance cameras are not just anywhere. They are positioned in specific ways, depending on specific logics, depending on specific objectives. Well, who should be controlled? What should be protected? These things are not neutral. I did myself, for my master thesis, actually, about 22 years ago, I walked through the city center of Geneva and I mapped surveillance cameras. And I found 22 years ago in Geneva, which is a very, very small city from a kind of Brazilian perspective, maybe 200,000 inhabitants. We found, just in the city center, we found about 300 cameras 22 years ago, which is quite a lot. But they were mostly private cameras, focused on public space, on pavements, on parks, on streets, all kinds of public spaces, external public spaces. But once you looked at the map, you could see very, very clearly that, well, there was a strong density of cameras in the financial district of the city. There were some increased camera densities in specific problem areas, and so on and so on. So it's all about, of course, a spatial distribution of the cameras, which is also the mirror of the objectives and the intentions behind. And the question of the body and of the kind of the behavior and of the people that are being exposed to this control, well, that's what it's all about. So space is not just material environment, it's also a lived reality. So the second point, I think, what's the time now? So 5:30. Right. So I'm taking much too much time here. I will skip Foucault. I think I will skip Foucault. Sorry about that. Yeah. No point in.
It's more known for it. No worries to skip Foucault.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Sloterdijk is interesting because he's one of those guys that, and he names it explicitly like this, who likes to play with joyful metaphors. He's great to read. I mean, thankfully he has this humor about him and his work, because you could almost believe in his kind of 3,000-page long trilogy that he really wants to explain the whole world. And I think that would be quite problematic, because he could never do that. It's one of these kind of very ambitious and very naive beliefs, especially of elderly white men, that they can explain the world with 3,000 pages. But thankfully, he's so funny and so kind of playful with his vocabulary. And I think that's, for me, that makes it really attractive. And I find it personally really intriguing and stimulating to think reality through terms like foam, for example. Foam as a kind of process of bubbles, a kind of an ensemble, a whole range of more or less chaotically organized bubbles. And as Sloterdijk himself says, for him, it's the kind of the spherical way of expressing Manuel Castell's network metaphor. So whenever we talk about network, we emphasize the connections between points, don't we? Well, transport networks, communication networks, we always talk about kind of infrastructure, specific lines, bringing together points. What the foam metaphor does is emphasize that each point in that network is a live world on its own, has its own atmosphere, its own volume. We are here creating a bubble together. We are bubbling. We are kind of creating a sphere of togetherness with a certain range of qualities, emotionally, affectively, practically, cognitively experienced qualities, to which we all contribute together. This atmosphere, this bubble here, within the larger foam structure of the university, let's say, because there's other bubbles all around the place, it's us who bring it into life. We do it together, of course, with the material environment. And this is where there's kind of the relational understanding of the spaces of togetherness as volumes, as shared spaces of experience. I think this is really what I'm interested in when I draw on Peter Sloterdijk. And his vocabulary to capture different logics of togetherness. The bubble, which would be the kind of the microspaces, the foam, which is the conglomerates of bubbles, but ever changing, ever volatile, ever flexible, ever liquid. I mean, this is what contemporary society is all about. We have lost this kind of fixity and stability of maybe the ancient times, where you grew up in a certain village, in a certain family, and you remained there until the end of your days. Now we are always moving. We are always belonging to different bubbles, to different communities, to different groups, maybe political groups, maybe social groups, maybe around hobbies, maybe about friends, maybe about, well, changing your space where you live, etc. So we really have this kind of bubbling and ever dynamic way of living. And I think, and the globe would then be the macrosphere, the kind of the sphere in which kind of larger collectives live together. For example, the nation state. For example, a whole city, maybe. I did actually quite a bit of work on the narratives around Olympic Games, and you could see that very often you saw actually drawings and visual representations of kind of globes around Olympic cities, as if they were homogeneous and kind of all-inclusive things. They're definitely not. But in the discourse, and especially in the Olympic discourse, they seem to be very nice, round, all-inclusive, and all kind of beautiful globes within which everybody lives together, and which is just, well, we all now live in a World Cup, so you know what I'm talking about. So now let's think about these kind of things, these kind of terms from a drone perspective. First of all, I think what is interesting for me here is that we move beyond only the smashing gaze on the ground. We talk about the atmospheres with which it interacts, which it creates, which can be atmospheres of fears. Well, the drone can be perceived as something quite threatening. So it does affect these kind of atmospheric constellations. It also kind of creates them. It creates, and that's from, let's say, from the pilot's point of view, they live in these kind of cube-like atmospheres. There is, in Switzerland, as in Brazil, I've been told, there is this obligation to keep the drone within visual line of sight. So you create a kind of a volume around you, which is an elemental volume filled with air, but also a relational volume, well, with all kinds of mediated relations, you and technology, you and others, you and, well, I mean, the environment. So I think these are also bubbling spaces, spread out much more or less widely, depending on the drone's capacities, depending on the type of use, depending on your own kind of movements on the ground. So these are also spaces of surveillance, but volumetric spaces. And even more importantly, if we draw on Sloterdijk's understanding, relational spaces, atmospheres. Right, so that's a second aspect which I personally find very interesting related to this kind of vocabulary. And the third one is the aspect of imagination. I mentioned that before when I talked about these Olympic cities, these kind of globes of togetherness. This is all about discourse. This is all about imagination, narrations. And here I have actually, I don't think you know this painter. It's absolutely wonderful, amazing painter from the Middle Ages. End of the Middle Ages in Switzerland, 1515. Hieronymus Bosch. This painting is called Temptation of St. Anthony. And you see actually flying history of imagination within a wider kind of imaginative history of technology and the volumes in which these technologies work. So we here have flying boats, we here have kind of flying fish, we here have riding monsters on these fish, we here have a sky that is populated with all kinds of weird figures, with all kinds of weird kind of technologies, or let's say socio-technical constructions, to use Bruno Latour's term. And what is the drone different than that? It's a new way of populating the sky with weird figures, with weird objects. A new way of both practically and imaginatively filling the volumes within which we live, and which are inherently relational, even if they're only imagined. So I love Peter Adie's work, and he has done a lot on the geography of the air. And he, in one of the papers, which I like in particular, he makes the connection between what he calls levitation and the drone. Levitation is like these flying people, you know, like there's a whole history of, I mean, angels are flying things, for example, but flying and kind of, you know, like Maria is often represented to be flying in the air. Jesus as well went to the sky. This whole kind of socio-cultural history of imagining kind of flying people, flying objects, flying technologies. He makes a connection between the drone and these kind of phenomena, these kind of imaginaries. And I think Sloterdijk's vocabulary, this idea of the spheres of togetherness, this idea of the kind of bubbles within which we live, which are both cognitive, imaginary, and affective, and of course filled with all kinds of bodies. That's one of the possible vocabularies, one of the possible kind of tools to think about joyful things, surprising things, but maybe all the more important things like, well, imaginations of the airspace, flying objects, flying figures, and the power that comes with them, that lies behind them, and that then results from these kind of new objects around us. So I think here we have, and of course now quite consciously, I mean, Kandinsky was very clearly structured, points, lines, planes. Here we are in a much more open and creative universe of terminology. Maybe some would call it almost a post-structuralist universe. But again, what I'm trying to say is that in all, well, now I only talk about two, I skipped Foucault, but in all the vocabularies, we win things and we lose things. And I think it's in playing with these vocabularies and in bringing them together and in trying to articulate them and in trying to really operationalize them, which means to define and then to use them within analysis, but also maybe political action. It also gives us a vocabulary for actual social and political action. So I think that's the task, or at least one task, which I would see myself to be given as a social scientist. Produce tools through which we can not only understand, but also act on the world. Thank you very much.
Na pergunta,
Yeah.
em português.
But,
O que eu vejo é uma grande euforia com essas novas tecnologias, tanto as forças policiais quanto governos, enfim, as pessoas acabam indo buscar esse tipo de ferramenta para, em tese, né, melhorar o serviço. Mas eu estudei isso e pesquisei bastante sobre o tema de tecnologia de reconhecimento facial aqui no Brasil. Não há acurácia nessas tecnologias, há um grande número de falsos positivos que acabam levando pessoas inocentes à prisão. Então, eu queria entender, aqui no Brasil não há nem lei específica que as pessoas usam esse tipo de tecnologia. A gente precisa de uma lei federal para poder aplicar de fato, só que em tese o que acontece em regra está acontecendo o contrário. As pessoas estão usando os governos, prefeituras, enfim, de uma forma indiscriminada esse tipo de tecnologia com várias violações a direitos humanos, principalmente. Queria entender como é que está funcionando isso lá na Suíça, se há alguma legislação, se vocês baniram, que em alguns lugares, até nos Estados Unidos, já baniram até esse tipo de tecnologia para fins, né, de execução penal, principalmente. Queria entender isso lá, como está funcionando.
okay. Thank you very much. Well, there's quite a few different things in your question, and I think the first one for me, which is really interesting, and with which I want to engage, is what you were saying, that they often don't really work. They are very limited, and I think that is something which I have seen in all my empirical work. This kind of limitedness of the technologies, which are, and here is that's the first level of response to the other question about Switzerland. I think we see in Switzerland a similar dynamic, which is well, at least if we simplify a bit, well, a kind of techno belief. Well, as long as we use technology, well, we will benefit. It will become better. And I think empirically, we can say very clearly that it's not enough to just add new technologies and to believe that this in itself helps anything or changes anything. What I have found is that in specific cases, in specific examples, technology can add a very important additional dimension, which can then be helpful or not, or problematic or not, but it can make a real difference. But only if it's integrated within a wider socio-technical system, to use again the Latourian expression. So, for example, if the police does not just put some surveillance cameras somewhere in a corner, but also uses them in active and practical ways to then optimize police patrols, for example, or to maybe intervene more quickly in case of a road accident, or in more focused ways in case of, I don't know, specific other policing issues. So if it's well integrated within a larger whole, then I think it can actually really make a difference. Now, what is interesting, and this is also something that came out of my empirical work, is that very often the police, at least in Switzerland, are actually quite, let's say, ambivalent, and sometimes even critical about new surveillance technologies, because they know very well that the overall budget will not increase. So if you buy new cameras for 2 million Swiss francs, you will need to kind of, well, not spend these 2 millions elsewhere, which is often, well, salaries. So actually there is a real issue here from a policing perspective in terms of keeping the right balance between the human and the technological measures which are being given to act on, let's say, specific situations from a policing background. And I find this interesting because this is exactly the kind of argument I've always made. It's that let's think about what we really need and what we really want as a society. Let's draw the line. Let's define the socially acceptable. Going beyond a simple kind of, you know, like a very pessimistic or a very naive, optimistic view of technology. Let's think about the articulation. Where do we want the human? Where do we want the technological? And I think if that was to be made as a society, I think technology could very well bring something positive with it. But if we just buy more stuff, it's not only can it be a social problem because we live increasingly in a kind of surveillance society, but it's also in some cases just simply throwing money out of the window because it's not what is really needed. So now the last point of your question was about the legal context. And what I find interesting in the Swiss context, maybe it's different in Brazil, you know better than I, but actually in the Swiss context, there is a specific privacy laws. But these privacy laws, they're interesting because for private actors, everything that is not explicitly forbidden can be considered to be allowed. So that's the logic of the legal kind of context in Switzerland. So as long as you don't really have a very detailed kind of privacy law, private actors can more or less do whatever they want. It would not be illegal. Now for the public actors, like the police, it's the other way around. Everything that is not explicitly allowed is forbidden, which means that actually it is much more difficult for the police to install a CCTV camera than for, let's say, a bank or another kind of private institution. And interestingly, if I've done several surveys amongst the population, both for to see how they perceive drones, but also to see how they perceive cameras. And what comes up all the time, and I mentioned that in Curitiba as well, is that people in Switzerland actually, they want the police to use these kind of things, but not the private actors. They are very critical when it comes to private drones, for example, when it comes to private cameras with a focus on public space. Whereas they trust the police and they want them to keep their kind of monopoly of the vertical gaze, if we want to say it like that. So there is an interesting tension on the one hand between a legal constellation, which means it's actually very easy for the private actors to use these kind of technologies and to install them. And also there's absolutely no register, for example. There is no actual control of private surveillance. I mentioned the 300 cameras. I mean, I had to walk through the city center to find them. There is no kind of official document which lists them, not at all. So on the one hand, having a very critical perspective, a critical perception of these things by the overall majority of the population. And I think, again, here we find interesting and important elements when it comes to this question of where to draw the line. What do we want as a society? What do we not want? And how to control and how to make sure that those things we want will be really used in the ways in which they are kind of meant to be used. I mean, as David Lyon very famously said, there is this concept of function creep. Once you have something for one thing, well, you can easily twist it a few years later and use it for other things. So there is this question of democratic control. There is this question of the democratic legitimacy of these technologies. And I think, especially if we consider that it makes these kind of things ever more distant, as I said before, this debate and this kind of societal reflection and questioning of the technologies, what do we want and how much and up to where, is ever more important today. And that's in a way also the kind of the maybe social dimension of my thoughts there. Other questions? Yeah.
tem um pouco a ver com essa resposta que você deu agora também, mas nessa sua pesquisa em relação aos drones, especificamente, como é que você vê, em relação a outras técnicas de vigilância, como que ele altera, desfaz um pouco, né, a noção do privado, né, que a gente acabou de falar sobre atores privados, né, usando o drone, invadindo espaços públicos, que as pessoas estão encontrando juntas. Isso aparece muito nesse estudo, essa questão do privado. E porque eu vi que você pesquisa um pouco sobre a questão da agricultura, né, dos drones na agricultura também. E é uma coisa que aqui eu pesquiso a fronteira agrícola, né, no norte, no região norte do país, que, enfim, tem essas propriedades muito mais tecnificadas, que têm acesso a drones, né, na agricultura com muita tecnologia, enfim, altamente tecnificado, que o drone aparece como, primeiro, como meio de vigiar a plantação, acompanhar a plantação, mas em alguns momentos, por exemplo, de conflitos agrários, né, populações tradicionais, ele tem esse desvirtuamento. Então, ele, por exemplo, sai da propriedade e vai invadir a propriedade do lado, e eu vejo esse desvirtuamento, aí você falou do twisting.
See, I mean, what you're describing is clearly at the very core of this problematic of the proliferating aerial gaze. I mean, it brings with it all kinds of new critical issues in terms of power. As you said, I mean, they can be used for controlling specific kind of marginalized populations in very undemocratic and very unlegitimized ways. But they can also be appropriated by activists, for example, to monitor the police or to monitor the big companies in their behavior. For example, deforestation is an example, an interesting example, where activists have for many, many years used drones to document specific kind of phenomena which they wanted to question and to act against. So it brings, this technology brings with it always these kind of new societal dynamics, because it can be appropriated more widely than the actual maybe initial thought was behind it. So what else to say? I mean, for me, the question is basically, especially if we talk about technology like the drone, is also, it's not just how can it be useful to one person or to one group or to another. It's also how, as a society, can we make sure that it's used in the right way. And this is the key issue. And I think for me, it's also an issue that goes beyond the law, because there can very well be a very nice law, but drones is the perfect example. I mean, they can be used in so flexible, so mobile and unpredictable ways that it is almost impossible to really intervene and to act against once somebody wants to use it, because it's unpredictable. It's so, and this is one of the key questions. How can we actually make sure that we stay within the limits of the acceptable? And I know that in Switzerland and in Europe more generally, maybe also in Brazil, I'm sorry, I don't know what happens right now in terms of legislation on drones, but in Switzerland and on a European scale, there's a lot of talk about new legislation, for example, obliging people to register when they use drones. There's also, I mentioned that in Curitiba as well, there is this kind of cat and mouse game between the drone industry and the anti-drone industry. I mean, there's so much equipment now out there on the market that is supposed to be able to defend against drones. I mentioned in Curitiba this example of Geneva police who have bought 2 eagle eggs because they want to educate the eagles to attack drones if need be. There's actually companies in the Netherlands who specialize in kind of anti-drone animals, anti-drone birds, most importantly. So of course that makes me smile, that makes you smile, but beyond that example, there is a much more critical question, which is really, again, on a practical level, how we can really control this technology and make sure that as a society we benefit from it as much as we can without being kind of the victims in a way of it. And I don't think there is an actual solution, a ready-made solution for that. But especially, I think, and I mean, I didn't mention that case study too much today, but I did for quite a while, for quite a few years actually. I was part of a working group of Neuchâtel police as a kind of a researcher, doing participant ethnographic observation. I was following them in their kind of thinking about buying a new drone, and it was quite interesting to see that they know very, very, very well and clearly that this is a technology they cannot really aspire to control. They cannot really create absolute security. They cannot really guarantee that there is no accident, or that is even worse, no terrorist strike with a drone, for example. So it's one of these technologies that really challenge the everyday kind of question of security and risk, especially in an urban context. Yeah.
Bom, obrigada, Francisco, pela sua fala. Nem farei em português minha questão. Minha questão é um pouco mais abstrata, talvez um pouco mais filosófica, pensando justamente a relação de opacidade que essas imagens de drone produzem, essa verticalização produz. Isso não é à toa que você também incorpora na sua pesquisa tende e Bosch, né? Que são artistas, e são artistas que lidam com a opacidade e com a imaginação, propondo outras formas ainda não imagináveis. E eu sempre penso nessa questão da verticalização do olhar, me lembro de uma história curiosa, mas também trágica, que é o fato de que em agosto de 44, pilotos aliados que sobrevoavam a região da Silésia à procura de usinas de produção de armamento, usinas alemãs de produção de armamento. Eles fotografaram todo o campo aéreo, não sei se você conhece essa história, e fotografaram Auschwitz Birkenau, mas não conseguiram decodificar essas imagens como sendo não as usinas de produção que eles queriam encontrar, mas as usinas de destruição que eles não imaginavam que existiam. Então, as imagens não foram vistas nem reconhecidas como tais. Então, foi preciso décadas. Só em 78, a CIA voltou essas imagens e ali identificou o campo de Auschwitz. Então, a minha questão é essa relação entre a visibilidade e a legibilidade em relação às imagens. Como lidar com essa opacidade, né? Com esse ato entre aquilo que a gente vê e aquilo que a gente consegue reconhecer.
Acho que isso tem a ver com o que a Fernanda e o Bruno perguntaram sobre os corpos também, né?
I think the example, of course, with Auschwitz and the planes flying over it and not really recognizing the horrors on the ground because it is kind of reduced to a two-dimensional visual representation. They didn't get the actual atmosphere on the ground, the whole kind of the whole complexity of these spaces. I think it's a particularly dramatic example, something that is for me at the very heart of today's way of managing everyday life through technologies, which means it always is inherently reductive of the actual reality it is supposed to act on. It reduces reality into a number of, into numbers very often, sometimes into two-dimensional images, sometimes into graphics, sometimes into other kind of visual representations. And then depending on these representations, which can be numbers or images or whatever, it acts on the reality. And there is this very important décalage in French, this kind of contrast between the reality itself, which we want to control and maybe to secure or maybe to improve or whatever, on which we want to act, and the means or the mediators that are being used and that produce a kind of a second reality, a reduced reality, which is then taken as the basis to act on the actual reality. So it's this reduction that occurs within the kind of the techno-mediated relation which we have to this reality. And I think in many cases this can really be a big problem. It can be a big problem because we can be dramatically mistaken. I mean, your example with Auschwitz shows that. I was quoting another example the other day about the Hillsborough disaster in Liverpool, at Liverpool Football Club, where actually a kind of a panic broke out in the stadium. And Richard Giulianotti, a good friend of mine, sports sociologist, he wrote a very interesting piece, and he said, well, basically the problem was there was no police on the spot. Every police officer was actually in the control room and watching only the screens of the cameras. And they could not get the feeling for the panic that was in the stadium and for the kind of the noises and for all the kind of the dynamics that unfolded. People were being crushed, people died, etc., etc. And they could not get the whole kind of reality. And also the cameras are inherently, I mean, they produce like a frame. It's the same with the drone, it's the same with the painting. We have only a limited kind of selection of reality, spatially speaking as well. So I think this is where the question of the human and technical comes back into play. How to articulate the two in the best possible way. How to kind of maintain a certain kind of human dimension that is able to capture the atmosphere, the relational space of reality, the whole complexity, whilst also maybe in punctual ways allowing technology to complement and to complete a given kind of system, which can in some cases save lives. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work on motorway surveillance, for example. I mean, this can be something that makes a big difference, but it has to be used in the right ways. And this right compromise between the human and the technological, I think that's at the very core of today's debate we need to have. But I mean, now I haven't really talked that much about the question of verticality. Very, very big question, and especially when we talk about policing, for example, or society in general, how do we relate to the verticality? How can we manage that? How can we deal with that, especially if we're not used to it? We are discovering it now in new ways, through technologies like the drone. And I think, again, that brings me back to all kinds of big debates which are just about to happen in Switzerland, for example, which is about urban verticality, urban air. Who can use it? I mean, can we accept drone taxis, for example? Do we have to forbid them? Where can we have them? Can we have them for specific deliveries, not for others? So what do we do with verticality? How can we as a society become conscious and responsible about the verticality or the volumetrics in which we live, and we increasingly live? And I think this is another big societal debate we had. I guess in Rio there are already helicopters in the city, but it's of course a very kind of socialist structure, very exclusive. So this question of power involved in that as well. Verticality for whom not? How, again, a question of societal acceptability, drawing the line. So, and this is the same thing applies, I think, also for the police. What does it mean for the police suddenly to become an everyday user of urban air? Because they all have drones now. How does that affect their work? How does it also affect maybe their way of intervening or of not intervening? So there's a big, it really, I think, redefines quite a few questions actually. Because I did, sorry, and this is my last element of response. I did also a survey amongst professional drone users in Switzerland. There were about 1,000 drone users participating in that survey. And what I saw was that the immense majority of these drone users, which are going from the police to private photographers, via archaeologists and urban planners, they have bought their drone in the last 5 years. So it's a thing that is so new and so growing exponentially, this kind of new social appropriation of the air, that we cannot yet have the right way of actually dealing legally and also practically with these new forms of verticality. But it doesn't mean that it's not dramatic or not important, but just to say this kind of thing, that's one of those phenomena which are so quick that society kind of falls behind. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Other questions? Or maybe we bring it to a line to close?
I need to teach class here.
Okay, oh, sure.
Um último comentário, Francisco, muito obrigada pela sua, enfim, pela sua fala, muito inspiradora. Então, uma última questão, talvez não é nem uma questão, é um comentário conversando com o que a Ilana trouxe. Que talvez tenha um paradoxo aí nesse poder de visão, né, do drone, que seria uma camada adicional de visão e uma visão muito totalitária, né, de cima para baixo, que está numa escala sobre-humana, etc., mas que talvez uma das características do exercício da violência desse olhar esteja mais ligado à opacidade do que à sua capacidade de ver propriamente. Seja porque o espaço fica abstrato, seja porque você desumaniza completamente a visão e, enfim, só trazendo esse elemento a mais para o exercício da violência desse olhar, talvez ele esteja mais relacionado à opacidade do que à capacidade de ver mais, ou melhor, né?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, this is, and for me, this brings me back to what I've been saying about this kind of distance. This distance which technology creates between social beings, social actors. It can be between surveillors and surveillance, or those who are being controlled and those who are controlling, but also between normal human beings. And I think this is where, yeah, it can really define what living and what being together means, and what these kind of spheres or these foams of togetherness, how they look like, and how they feel on an affective, on a bodily, on a kind of practical, everyday level. And I think this is where technology really, and I mean, in recent years, we have moved from this surveillance society to a surveillance culture terminology. And I think this is where surveillance and technology really becomes a cultural issue, when it really affects the ways in which we understand what being human means, and being together means, and being kind of in contact means, and all of that. So I will not go much further, but these are big philosophical questions. And again, I think, well, maybe let me just one final word. For me, we need the vocabulary, we need the kind of the tools, the conceptual and then analytical tools to really capture these transformations, and then to act against, if need be. If that's the kind of well, yeah. Now I'm speaking. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado para o seu atenção. Eu acho que foi bem difícil, mas thank you very much. It's been wonderful.